The year was 1888. London's East End was a place of shadows and cold. A thick, yellow fog often covered the streets, making everything dim and unclear. In Whitechapel, gas lamps struggled to light the narrow alleyways. The air was heavy with many smells: coal smoke, wet garbage, and cheap gin. Poor people lived here, close together in old, broken buildings. Life was hard, and hope was often scarce. Night brought more darkness and more danger. Footsteps echoed on wet cobblestones. A cold wind blew, carrying whispers through the slums. Every shadow seemed to hide something evil, a silent observer in the dark. People hurried home, pulling their thin coats tight. They felt a growing fear, a sense that something terrible was happening, just out of sight. A hidden threat moved through these very streets. No one knew who this threat was. They did not know his name, his face, or where he came from. But soon the world would know a name that would echo through history: Jack the Ripper. This person would commit terrible, bloody murders, becoming the most infamous serial killer the world had ever known. The victims were women living hard lives in these poor parts of London. Their lives were difficult, and their violent deaths would shock everyone. This is a story about those dark days in London. It is about the fear that gripped a city and the police who searched for answers. It is about the brutal crimes that happened one after another, leaving a trail of terror. But more than just a tale of murder, this is a story about a great, dark mystery. It is a puzzle that has never been solved, even after more than 100 years. Who was Jack the Ripper? Why did he do these terrible things? The answers still wait in the shadows of the past. 2. The Dark Streets. Whitechapel in 1888 was a place of deep poverty. Many people lived in this part of East London. The streets were often dark and dirty. Houses were small and very crowded. Irish people and Jewish refugees came to London, making the area even more full. By 1888, about 80,000 people lived in Whitechapel, and there was not enough for everyone. Life was very hard. Many people could not find good work. 55% of children born in the East End died before the age of 5. Robbery, violence, and drinking too much alcohol were common problems. Because there was no money, many women had to work on the streets to survive. In October of that year, London's police knew there were about 62 brothels and 1,200 women working as prostitutes in Whitechapel. Every night, thousands of people slept in common lodging houses. About 8,500 people stayed in 233 such places. A bed could cost 4 pence, or roughly £2 in today's money. Sometimes people only had 2 pence and would sleep hanging over a rope to save money. This shows how desperate their lives were. These women were very vulnerable, walking the dark streets alone. At the same time, there was much anger in the city. Between 1886 and 1889, frequent protests sometimes turned violent. The police often got involved, but people were still unhappy. Whitechapel had a bad name. People thought it was a place of crime and immorality. Early rumors of a killer spread. People talked about someone called Leather Apron.
This name came from newspaper stories. A local man, John Pizer, who worked with leather, was even arrested. But he was released because he had a strong alibi, meaning he was somewhere else. The fear grew, and everyone knew a killer was active. The crowded, dark streets of Whitechapel were not safe. For many women, this environment itself was a deadly trap, waiting for the first awful attack. 3. The first killings. The dark days of August and September 1888 brought terrible news to Whitechapel. The first of the brutal murders happened on August 31st. A woman named Mary Ann Nichols was found in Bucks Row, a street in Whitechapel. It was very early in the morning, around 4 o'clock. She was lying on the ground, dead. Her body showed a shocking crime. Her throat had 2 deep cuts. One of these cuts went almost all the way through her neck. Her lower stomach was also cut open with a long, rough wound, and some of her inside organs could be seen. There were also other cuts on her stomach.
This was a truly terrible sight, and it spread fear among the poor people of the East End. The police began to look for answers, but they had very little to go on. Just 1 week later, on September 8th, the violence grew worse. Another woman, Annie Chapman, was found dead. Her body was discovered around 6 o'clock in the morning in the yard of a house on Hanbury Street in Spitalfields. This quick second murder made people even more afraid. It showed that the killer was not stopping. Annie Chapman's murder was even more violent than the first. Her throat also had 2 deep cuts, just like Mary Ann Nichols. But this time, her stomach was cut completely open. The killer had moved parts of her body. A piece of her stomach skin was placed on her left shoulder. Some of her small organs were on her right shoulder. The killer also took out some of her inside organs, including her uterus and parts of her bladder. This increase in violence and the removal of organs puzzled the police. It suggested that the killer might have some knowledge of the human body, perhaps like a doctor or a butcher. The murderer was becoming bolder and more brutal with each attack. The community was gripped by terror, and everyone wondered who this cruel killer could be. People in London were now very scared, knowing a dangerous killer walked their streets, growing more daring with each dark night. 4. 2 deaths in one night. The early morning hours of Sunday, September 30th, 1888, brought more horror to London. This night would become known as the double event. The killer attacked 2 women within a very short time, just an hour apart. Elizabeth Stride was the first victim found. Her body was discovered around 1 o'clock in the morning. It was in Dutfield's Yard, a small alley near Berner Street in Whitechapel. Her throat was cut very deep. It was one clean cut that ended her life quickly. But there were no other wounds on her body. No organs were missing, unlike some victims before her. Police thought that someone might have stopped the killer. Perhaps he could not finish his usual brutal work. Many people had seen Elizabeth Stride earlier that night. She was with different men, but no one could agree on what the man looked like. This made it hard for the police to find a suspect. Just 45 minutes later, another terrible discovery was made. Catherine Eddowes was found dead in Mitre Square. This place was a short walk from Berner Street, but it was in a different part of London, the City of London. Her injuries were much worse than Elizabeth Stride's. Her throat was cut from one ear to the other. Her stomach was ripped open with a long, sharp wound. Her insides were placed over her right shoulder. A piece of her left kidney and a part of her womb were taken away. Eddowes's face was also badly damaged.
She had cuts on her nose, cheeks, and even her eyelids.
The doctors who looked at her body said these terrible wounds would have taken at least 5 minutes to make. This meant the killer had enough time to do his full, gruesome work. He was not disturbed this time. These two murders, happening so close in time and place, showed how daring the killer had become. He could kill 2 women in different locations in less than an hour. The fear in Whitechapel grew even more. Later that same morning, around 2:55, police found a blood-stained piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron. It was near the entrance of a building on Goulston Street. This street was not far from Mitre Square. Above the apron, a message was written on the wall with chalk. It said, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." This message, called the Goulston Street Graffito, worried everyone greatly. It made people think the killer wanted to blame Jewish people for the murders, but it was not clear if the killer wrote it. Maybe it was just someone else's message, unrelated to the crimes. Or perhaps it was a trick from the killer himself, a way to confuse the police. Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren was very concerned. He feared the message could start angry fights against Jewish people. So he quickly ordered the writing to be washed off the wall before sunrise. He did not want more people to see it. With 2 women dead in one single night and a puzzling message left behind, the police faced a growing mystery. The killer was not only taking lives brutally, he also seemed to be making fun of the police, challenging them to catch him. The pressure on the officers grew with each new attack. The streets of Whitechapel remained gripped by terror. 5. The Last Woman. The story of the Whitechapel murders came to its most horrifying end with Mary Jane Kelly. She was the last of the canonical 5 victims. Her death marked a terrible climax in the series of brutal crimes. On Friday, November 9th, 1888, Mary Jane Kelly's body was discovered. She lived in a small, single room at number 13 Miller's Court. This address was in a narrow alley just off Dorset Street in Spitalfields, a very poor part of London. What happened to Mary Jane Kelly was the most awful and gruesome of all the murders in this dark period. Unlike the previous 4 victims, this murder happened indoors, within the privacy of her own room. This gave the killer a unique advantage: time. He was completely hidden from the street, able to carry out his horrific work without any fear of being seen or interrupted. When her body was found at 10:45 in the morning, the sight in her small room was one of sheer, unimaginable horror. Mary Jane Kelly's face had been cut and damaged so severely that it was hacked beyond all recognition. It was impossible to tell who she was from her face. Her throat had been severed with deep cuts, all the way down to the bones of her spine. The killer had then opened her body. Her abdomen was almost completely emptied of its internal organs. He did not just remove them, he rearranged them in a chilling way. Her uterus, kidneys, and one breast were carefully placed beneath her head. Other body parts, known as viscera, were scattered about the room. Some lay beside her foot, others were draped across the bed. Even sections of her abdomen and thighs were found placed upon a small bedside table. Most disturbingly, her heart was nowhere to be found in the room. It was entirely missing from the crime scene. Further details made the scene even more disturbing. Ashes were discovered within the small fireplace in her room. These ashes suggested that the murderer had made a fire. He likely burned several items to create light, allowing him to see clearly as he performed his terrible mutilations. The fire had been so hot and recent that it had melted the solder holding a kettle's spout, causing it to fall into the grate of the fireplace. This showed the killer took a long time, working with a cold calm to complete his horrific acts. This final, terrible murder in Miller's Court sent waves of terror through London, especially among the poor residents of Whitechapel. It was the most brutal crime committed by the unseen killer, representing the height of his madness and cruelty. The level of violence reached its absolute peak.
The story tells us that neighbors, living in the cramped buildings of Miller's Court, heard a cry of murder during the night. Yet nobody came to help, or perhaps nobody dared. This chilling detail highlights the deep sense of fear and isolation that hung over the city's East End. In those crowded, desperate streets, people often felt alone, and the omnipresent terror meant that even hearing a scream might not make someone risk their own life. This pervading sense of isolation, combined with the extreme fear, was a dark and heavy burden for the people of London during this time, and the identity of the killer remained a terrifying mystery. 6. Letters to the police. After the terrible killings, police officers and newspaper offices got many letters. There were hundreds of these letters. Most were not real, or they did not help the investigation. However, 3 letters became very famous. They made the unknown killer known around the world. The first was called the Dear Boss letter. It was dated September 25, 1888. The Central News Agency received it and then sent it to Scotland Yard. At first, the police thought it was a trick. The writer of the letter claimed to be the murderer. He wrote that he would clip the lady's ears off. Later, when Catherine Eddowes was found dead, a part of her ear was cut. This made some people think the letter was real. In this letter, the writer first used the name Jack the Ripper. This name quickly became famous for the killer. But many people, including police officials, believed that journalists wrote these letters. They wanted to make their newspapers more popular and sell more copies. One journalist even said later that he and a colleague wrote them to keep the story exciting. Then came the Saucy Jackie postcard. It was sent on October 1st, 1888. The handwriting on this card was like the Dear Boss letter. It talked about the double event, which meant the 2 murders that happened on the same night. People thought it was strange that the writer knew these details. But the postcard was sent more than 24 hours after the killings. By then, the news was already in newspapers, and people in Whitechapel were talking about it, so anyone could have known the details. This postcard was also seen as a hoax, likely from a journalist. The third important letter was named From Hell. George Lusk, a man who led the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received it on October 16, 1888. This letter looked different from the others. The handwriting and style were not the same. Inside the package, Lusk found a small box. In the box was half of a human kidney. It was kept in alcohol. The killer had taken Catherine Eddowes' left kidney. The letter claimed the writer had fried and ate the other half of the kidney. This was a shocking detail. Doctors examined the kidney. They said it was human and came from the left side of a body. However, they could not say for sure if it was Catherine Eddowes' kidney. People still discuss if this kidney was really from a victim or just a cruel joke to scare people. Police tried to find out who wrote these letters. They showed copies of the Dear Boss letter and the postcard to the public. but no one recognized the handwriting. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, believed the letters were all just hoaxes. He thought they were not from the real killer. These letters, real or not, helped to make the legend of Jack the Ripper grow. Who was the killer? The police investigation began immediately after the first murders in Whitechapel. A large team of officers worked hard, going house to house, questioning over 2,000 people. Police looked closely at more than 300 suspects and arrested 80. Key detectives like Frederick Aberline led parts of this important search. The City of London police also joined the hunt when one murder happened in their area. Because of the very brutal killings, police thought the killer might have special skills, like a butcher or a doctor. They checked the alibis of many local butchers and their workers. 76 shops were visited. However, no strong evidence was found. Even Queen Victoria wondered if the killer could be a butcher from a cattle boat, but this idea led nowhere.
Later, police doctor Thomas Bond made an early criminal profile. He studied the 5 main murders, believing all were done by the same person. Bond thought the killer was a solitary man with strong, dark, violent desires. He believed the killer did not have advanced surgical skills. The women were probably lying down when murdered, and their throats were cut first, he concluded. Many suspects have been named over the years. Some were in old police files, like Aaron Kosminski, a Whitechapel barber, or Montague Druitt. Over 100 different people have been suggested, including famous ones like artist Walter Sickert, though these were much later ideas. The evidence against any suspect was never strong enough for a charge or conviction. The investigation faced huge challenges. In the 1880s, police lacked modern forensic tools like fingerprinting or DNA testing. Also, many important police files were lost during the Second World War. This made reviewing old clues difficult. Modern DNA attempts on old evidence, like letters, have been criticized. The evidence was handled by many people, making it contaminated and unreliable. Because of these issues, Jack the Ripper's identity remains one of the world's greatest unsolved mysteries. No one was ever caught. The police tried their best with limited tools, but the truth about the killer is still hidden. This leaves a sense of unresolved justice, a puzzle never fully solved. The end.
The killings that many people believed were done by Jack the Ripper stopped in late 1888. Mary Jane Kelly's murder was the last that most experts connect to him. After this, the great fear slowly went down, but the mystery stayed. No one ever found out who the killer was. The way newspapers covered these murders was new for its time. More people in England could read now, and cheap newspapers meant that news spread very fast. This was not the first serial killer, but it was the first time such crimes caused a worldwide media stir. During the worst of the murders, over 1 million newspapers were sold every day. This huge attention made Jack the Ripper a name known far beyond London. The name itself came from a letter sent to the press, possibly a trick by journalists to make the story bigger. This helped to make the killer a part of dark folklore. People began to imagine him in many ways, like a scary phantom in the streets, a true children's bogeyman. He became a figure in many works of fiction, like books and films. At first, people saw him as a monster, a dark shadow. Later, in movies, he was shown as a normal man with a terrible secret. Sometimes he was even shown as a rich gentleman, making people think about how the rich might harm the poor. His story mixed with other scary tales, always changing but always famous. The women who died were not just victims of a killer. They were also victims of a hard life.
They lived in Whitechapel, a very poor part of London. Many were prostitutes trying to survive. Their terrible deaths made people pay attention to the bad living conditions, the crowded houses, and the general poverty in the East End. In the years after the murders, some of these very poor areas were improved or even torn down. The crimes helped to show how society had failed these women, especially those at the bottom. Today, many people still study the case. They call this study ripperology. But despite all the books and research, no one has ever found the killer. The lack of modern tools like fingerprinting or DNA tests meant that the police had a very difficult job. Over 100 suspects have been named over the years, but the truth remains a secret. The case of Jack the Ripper is one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in history. It continues to capture people's minds, almost 140 years later. What do you think is the most interesting part of the Jack the Ripper mystery?
Hey there! Just a second before you go. If you learned something new today, please give this video a like, write your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. It only takes a second, and it really, really helps to create even better English videos for you. Your support means the world.